Welcome to the Book Blast podcast and our international podcast series, Bridging the Divide, Translation and the Art of Empathy. We are showcasing a selection of the best writing in translation from around the world being published this year in the UK by 10 leading independent houses, along with a trailblazing publisher specialising in translation. Today I am interviewing Adam Freudenheim, publisher and managing director of Pushkin Press, which is dedicated to publishing novels, essays, memoirs and children's books. This interview is being recorded via Zoom at the beginning of the COVID-19 lockdown. Thank you, Adam, for agreeing to be interviewed.
So tell us a bit about yourself.
Thank you for having me, Georgia. I'm delighted to take part in this. It's a wonderful initiative. I grew up primarily on the East Coast of the United States, but I've lived in the UK for half my life now, for the last 23 years. I arrived here in 1997. My parents were great readers, and they are still great readers now in their 80s. It's only changed, I would say, the way in which they consume, the books, which is a lot more ebooks and audiobooks than when I was growing up. Yeah, their reading habits were very eclectic and very Catholic, I would say. Mostly fiction, though. Mostly classics, modern classics, and then a lot of, the big heavyweights of contemporary literature. My father was always reading the latest Philip Roth or John Updike or William Boyd or David Lodge. Mostly male writers, it would be, that he would have read when I was growing up.
What about translations? Did you remember reading any of the great classics, even in translation, or contemporary
absolutely.
writers?
I might.
Translation when you were growing up.
My father had definitely read, had read lots of classics in translation as well himself. And I remember reading, certainly as a teenager, I read a lot of Russian classics. I was particularly taken with Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, as well as Thomas Mann and other major European writers of the 20th century. On my father's bookshelf, and I certainly discovered them there first, I would say.
Was there a particular book that made you fall in love with reading, or rather was there an author who you were absolutely crazy about?
Absolutely. I'm sure like anyone who reads, that was the case with me. But I think in terms of, I was in love with reading from as long as I can remember. I mean, I think my parents read to me from, again, before I can even remember, and I was reading. I can't remember a time where I wasn't reading every night, before bed, as well as any other time that I could find, really. And in that way, I do feel lucky to have grown up with fewer distractions. My parents also didn't have cable television. We never had that growing up. And we didn't even get a video recorder until I was 15 years old. So we had television, of course, but it did mean that there weren't that many things to do inside other than read, really, which helps enormously, I have to say. And in terms of particular writers, I read so much. And I think when I was probably about 11 or 12, I remember really getting into Agatha Christie, probably 12. And I collected every single Agatha Christie. I don't actually think I read every single one of them, but I probably read 50 or more of them. They were hugely enjoyable. I found with all three of my children that they also enjoyed them a lot around that age. That's 12, 13. So there's something about Agatha Christie that certainly works in that way. And then when I was a teenager, as I was saying, when I was a little older, I was very into heavy philosophical Russian literature, European literature generally, I would say.
Well, Christie, she is a good plotter, creating suspense when one is that age. How did you end up working in the publishing industry? Was it intentional? How did that?
It was very intentional. It was very intentional, and I think it goes back to the luck that I had that where I lived in Washington, D.C. was right around the corner from Politics and Prose, which had just opened, which is one of the great independent bookstores in America now, generally regarded. But it had only just opened in the mid-'80s, early mid-'80s. When we moved nearby, it was literally 3 blocks from my house. And this is relevant because I got my first job there, and I ended up working 2 and sometimes 3 nights a week in this bookstore from 8 to 10 p.m. when I was 15 or 17. I can't remember exactly, that sort of age. And so it definitely put me on the track, I think, where I ended up. And how I directly got into publishing, I lived in Germany for a year in Berlin after I graduated from university. And then I went back to the US and did this publishing course which was then known as the Radcliffe Publishing Course and took place at Harvard, and it's now become the Columbia Publishing Course in New York, and they even have a sort of branch at Oxford every year. But I did that course, which was magazine and book publishing. That led me to deciding that, yes, book publishing was what I wanted to do. And I started the way a lot of people do, with work experience, and then got a job as an assistant and so on.
From America to Berlin to London, I mean, how did that, your trajectory?
So I came here originally to the UK for postgraduate work, and I did an MPhil in European literature, in German, French, and English literature, and then I stayed on. So that's how that happened. And the way I lived in Berlin, because I had studied German literature as my major in college in the US, and I'd also lived there as an exchange student for a year in high school. Well, I lived in Germany for about 2.5 years of my life, from the age of 15 to 21.
Penguin Classics, then Modern Classics, and Reference was from 2004 to 12. So describe how long were you there, and what did you?
I think as so much in life, I was in the right place at the right time. They had reorganized Penguin Classics a little bit. And in the beginning of 2004, they created a new role of Penguin Classics publisher. I was lucky enough to be hired for it. I was at Yale University Press in London at the time. I think that the reason that they were attracted to me is that I had that kind of academic publishing grounding, and I also had the languages. And at the same time, I was young. I was only 29 at the time I was appointed. And I think they wanted someone who was kind of going to bring a different perspective and a kind of youthful energy. That was an amazing time. Penguin is an incredible company. Obviously, this is before the merger with Random House, so it happened after I left.
Peter Mayer and Peter Carson. I mean, I remember them back in the I suppose early 90s. Was it their time?
Peter Mayer left in, I think, 1996, 97, so that is before my time, and Peter Carson a little after that. I actually had the luck to work with Peter Carson as a consultant to Penguin Classics when I was there, and got to know him very well. He was a wonderful man and a wonderful publisher, very gifted. Penguin had a very, I think still has, even with the merger, but certainly when I was there, it didn't feel hugely corporate. There was a real sense of loyalty to Penguin, the brand, and as a company, and I think that is still the case for a lot of people. Most of my colleagues, not all, but most of the colleagues I worked with are still at Penguin even 8 years later. So that gives you an idea. Many of them had been there before I joined, so it was a fantastic place, and I couldn't be doing what I'm doing now without the 8 years I spent as publisher at Penguin Classics.
And were there particular authors you worked on when you were there?
Well, I had oversight over the whole list. Well, I had people working with me, obviously, but I worked on the estates of Steinbeck and Waugh and Arthur Miller and Nabokov and Kerouac, and had to commission new introductions, new translations of Dostoevsky, of Tolstoy, of Aristotle, of Plato, of you name it. It was a really extraordinary place to be and list to be involved with, and I think I kind of the thing that kind of was most exciting for me, perhaps, as a discovery and a publisher, was that I published the first English language edition of Hans Falada's novel Alone in Berlin. It sold about 250,000 copies for Penguin the year it came out in paperback, and I think it has now sold about 500,000 copies in total for Penguin.
Wow!
So,
publishing classics, so that requires a special acuity, a special, I don't know if you say a nose for what will work, but what actually makes a classic?
I mean, this is a good question. I think it's constantly evolving. And I think, in a nutshell, I always said when I was at Penguin, I still feel it's the case, it's a book that has stood the test of time. And then, in a way, what a period of time is changes often. And I could see that change while I was at Penguin, and even more so since. I mean, there's certain books that I proposed while I was at Penguin that people said, oh, that can't be a modern classic, that's much too recent. And then I've noticed that subsequently they've published, these books in the last few years. I mean, because I left 8 years ago. So I think people's definitions are constantly shifting, and the sense of time is constantly shifting too. there are quite a lot of books now from the 80s and 90s in the Penguin Modern Classics list, in a way that there weren't, 5 or 10 years ago. And, but the classics obviously the Penguin Classics encompasses in a way everything from the Epic of Gilgamesh until, books from 10 or 15 years ago. Mm-hmm. So there are over 2,000 individual titles on that list, and it's constantly growing. And I think the more interesting thing is how you publish them and how you go about doing that. And that's where the kind of creativity of being a publisher comes in.
So Pushkin Press focuses on modern classics rather than ancient or, say, 19th century. And it's mostly translated. So they do some things that aren't translations, but a large percentage is translation. I'm right in saying that?
Oh yes, about three quarters of what Pushkin publishes across all our imprints is translation, whether that's children's or crime or classics or contemporary. And the classics list is overwhelmingly translation, probably 85 or 90%. And you're absolutely right to say that it's mainly modern classics. It's sort of from the our key period, I would say, is the 1920s to the 1940s, 20s, 30s, 40s. And but we publish outside of that too. And, we have some 19th century work, and we also have some books from the, 50s and 60s that are on the classics list.
So how did you discover your most successful, no longer forgotten comeback author, Stefan Zweig? Because, of course, he was in his time huge and then disappeared down a black hole, and then you brought him to life again, so to speak. So how did all that happen?
I'd read Zweig myself as a teenager. In fact, I read The World of Yesterday and his autobiography and other stories of his chess story, which I'd also read when I was younger. I can't take credit, actually, for Zweig's publication by Pushkin in the first instance, because I took over the press in 2012, and it was founded 15 years before that. And Zweig was one of the very first authors that was published by Pushkin Press. Mm-hmm. But what I can say is that it was one of the things that attracted me to it, and we have continued to grow and develop that Zweig list. Every year, I think, as long as I've been there, we publish something new in translation by Zweig, as well as repackaging things and trying to represent them in different ways. We have over 30 titles in print by Zweig on the list.
All the same translator or different translators? How do you go about?
So it's a mix. I mean, Anthea Bell, the late great Anthea Bell, who died, sadly died. Many of the translations are by Anthea Bell, but she obviously was very busy, and she's also been dead the last couple of years, sadly. So Will Stone, the poet, has translated quite a lot of Zweig for us as well, and we've done very well with both of their translations. And there are a few books where we've used older translations from the 1930s and 40s, but the overwhelming majority are new translations by Anthea Bell and Will Stone.
Mm-hmm. So tell us about the Pushkin collection. So going back to also some of the classics of the 19th century, because you have Tolstoy and Gogol, and then very interesting, you have lesser known authors like Teffy, and also they are very beautifully production values, to use a rather industry expression. They're beautiful books. So it's quite continental, that actually, the series, you kind of want to collect them all. That's clever, because you really do want to collect them all. They're lovely. Obviously, extraordinary, wonderful writing. Tell us a bit about some of the other writers, the Pushkin collection, how that is evolving.
Yeah, so the Pushkin collection is what we call that, as you say, that series of physically small books that Pushkin has been known for since it started. So the first books that appeared in 1998 were in this format, which was pretty shamelessly ripped off from Celerio, the Italian publisher. The exact same format. We really like the format, and we've kept the same. We use the same printer, and we use the same text paper and typeface and everything. But what we did update is the cover design slightly. So we've had the last 8 years a much more modern cover design, and we commission original illustrations for almost every Pushkin collection title. We've also expanded the collection because one of the oddities about Pushkin Press when I took over is that despite the name, it didn't publish any Russian literature, and which is completely absurd. And yes, so one of the first things I did, actually, I commissioned was a little collection of stories and poems by Pushkin himself.
The Queen of Spades, that's the famous story.
The Queen of Spades, exactly. So we published The Queen of Spades with the Station Master's Daughter and a selection of poetry. We've also published Pushkin's Yevgeny Onegin, and we're also, I'm very proud, we've actually really expanded the Russian classics publishing within the collection. So one of our early sort of breakthrough successes was a writer called Gaito Gazdanov, mainly for the 1940s, 50s, and early 60s. We are about to actually publish, I think, the 5th or 6th book of his, but the first one we did was called The Spectre of Alexander Wolff, which we published in 2013, I believe it was. And that was a complete rediscovery. He was entirely out of print in English. So that was nice. And we also added Tefi, a wonderful Russian writer, died in the early 1950s, but most of her work is from the 20s. Anyway, she'd never been published in English before at all except in, an anthology. So we've now published, I think, 3 books by her, and we have a 4th one coming late next year. So yeah, we've really tried to expand the Russian component, and we've also done new translations and new selections of stories by Tolstoy and by Gogol, and we have a new collection coming up by Turgenev. We're about to publish a new collection of stories by Joseph Roth, and the Japanese writer Akutagawa. We also have a collection of his coming up later in the year.
Tell us about One. Now you start with One, and you've also started some children's books. A bit about that.
Yes, well, One is our English language imprint. Effectively, it's the home for our all the books that we publish that were originally written in English are published in the One imprint, and that is mainly literary fiction and some memoir and narrative nonfiction. It's a small list of a handful of books each year. The children's list, which I started almost immediately upon coming to Pushkin, and which launched in spring of 2013, mainly focused on translations to begin with and classics. We've had a lot of success there. Most notably, probably to listeners, with The Letter for the King by Tonka Draft, which in the last week has actually been released as a Netflix 6-part series, and that never would have come about without our publishing it in English for the first time. It's a Dutch classic from the 1960s, a wonderful, really wonderful children's book, which is our best-selling children's book and continues to sell very well around the world. We've also published books translated on the children's list from Japanese, from Icelandic, from German, from French, from Italian, from Spanish, lots of different languages, and some of them are contemporary as well, though the contemporary list is more English language, not exclusively.
Tom Rosenthal said of the late, great Sonny Mehta that he was able to handle the crudest commerce and the finest literature with equal skill. This paradoxical challenge is faced by all publishers. So how do you manage to balance crude commerce and literary finesse?
It's a very good question. I think the reality is that you obviously need to sell books, and I think that one of the things that I've always cared about is trying to reach. It's not good enough to just print the book. You have to publish it, and what that means is obviously getting people to buy it and to read it, and that's always excited me. The way that you spread the word about your books. So I don't think there's everyone has to balance it as Sonny observed, but you're trying to publish books that you believe in one way or another. And I think what Sonny always felt was, as I understood it, was that even if he was publishing something that was he thought was going to be a rip-roaring bestseller, he thought it was the best in class for that particular genre or that kind of book. And I suppose the way I approach it, we don't have a particularly commercial list, and that's quite deliberate. We have a small list that's on the literary side, but we make sure that every book we publish, we're publishing very deliberately, and that there is someone with a passion for the book and publishing vision, that the editor who acquires the book really loves it and is passionate about it and wants to find readers for it, because that's ultimately what makes it exciting and fun for us as publishers. It's not just printing it, it's publishing.
Which brings us to Mazel Tov, Margot van der Straten's unusual autobiographical novel about life in Antwerp's modern Orthodox Jewish community. Reading is like a window opening onto another world. It is an extraordinary and truly unique, different, unusual book. How did you spot it and get it translated?
I'm very proud of publishing this book, which I love personally, and I've been very gratified by the response it's had and how it's been received in English. I think the way I acquired it is pretty typical of the way that Pushkin goes about things. We are in touch with any number of international publishers, agents, rights people, translators, and we're talking to them all the time about books that they're excited about. In this particular case, it was actually the Dutch publisher, and it was a rights person there that I'd known for a while and had bought other books from, and so they really thought I'd be interested in it, and I was. And they had produced a very short sample, which I liked, but that's obviously not enough to buy a book. So I had the book read by a couple different people. But in addition, the book had also sold incredibly well in Belgium. It was being translated into German, Polish, French, possibly more languages, but several other languages. So I could talk to the other editors who'd acquired it in those houses. And yeah, that's effectively how I went about it, and was only published at the end of January, early February 2020, so it hasn't been out for very long now, but it's had a nice response so far.
Yeah. So what kind of person do you think makes a very good translator? Because it's great that translation is far more from, I think, certainly from when I started in publishing, though there were people like John Calder and Marion Boyars, but it was less, there's much more translation, there's much more going on. All the same, to be a very good translator, you talk about Anthea Bell, and I can think of a couple of other great translators I have been lucky enough to know in the past. That is special. So what would you say, what kind of person, what makes a very special, good translator?
I think my view of this has changed a lot over the years. And the whole, what makes a good translator? I've changed my view on this over the years, I think, and I definitely don't think there's one answer. And when I first started working with translators at Penguin Classics, they were almost entirely, not entirely, but they were almost entirely academics or retired academics. They were doing it on the side, or they were, in some cases, they were writers who happened to know another language, and they were doing it because they were passionate about that language or that work. It's become a much more professional field over the last 10, 15 years. There's a lot more being translated into English by many publishers, large and small. And there are courses, of course, where people can study translation, and there are mentorship programs and all these sorts of things. So I think, that definitely has had an effect. But I don't think there's one thing, as I say, that makes a good translator. I work with translators who are poets themselves, or fiction writers in some cases. I work with some who only do translation work. I recently published a biography of Rembrandt by Onno Blom called Young Rembrandt, and the translator of that works in the Dutch Foreign Ministry and does a lot of translation of that kind. But she's also a specialist in art, in art history. So she's done a lot of museum catalogs and things of that kind, and she really knows her art history. But she's an extremely good translator. So I think different work requires different kinds of translators, and they're all out there. I mean, they're an incredible group of people.
In this country, why, in your view, in the UK, is there still such reticence on the part of the dominant literary establishment and booksellers to publish, review, promote literature in translation, despite the success of leading translation publishers like aforementioned Macleho's Press, Fitzcarraldo, yourselves, of course, many others, and smaller specialised presses? There is, and the recent context doesn't help, but why is there such a reticence?
I actually don't think I disagree with the premise. I think it would have, it would have been a fair thing to say 10 years ago, and certainly when I moved from Penguin to Pushkin, part of the reason I decided to do what I'm doing at Pushkin was to push contemporary literature and translation. I think there's been a complete change, a sea change in the industry, because there have been lots of successes, whether it's Stieg Larsson on the commercial side or obviously Elena Ferrante. There are many other examples. And I think that there's less and less of a reticence about it. The reason I think that, the bigger, on the whole, the bigger publishing houses aren't publishing as much in translation is, it's not their focus, though increasingly they are doing more of it. And there is a lot of great English language writing from all over the world. And I think people sometimes forget this, that, the English language writing community, when you take into account the traditions of Britain and Ireland and the US and Canada and Australia and India and South Africa, and, it's a huge, huge group of people writing in English from very different, diverse viewpoints. So I think that I don't think it's really just a sort of parochialism, which is sometimes talked about as. But I feel pretty optimistic. There's a huge amount of passion for books from other countries in the trade as well. From booksellers, from Waterstones, from Daunt, and other independent bookshops. So I feel really optimistic about it. I mean, if anything, I think it's still reviewers. I always find it amusing in some of the papers. They still, as a category, as a genre, they have translated fiction, a roundup, or whereas it's not a category. It doesn't, from my point of view, it's a completely misleading way of talking about it. It's not how we talk about it at Pushkin. It's not how I think readers engage with books either. You want to read a great thriller, and do you care whether it was translated or not? No. Or you want to read whatever kind of book it is, and the styles are so varied that it's a complete, I think it's completely wrong to think of translated fiction as a category. It really isn't, and I don't acquire books in that way or publish them in that way.
And that actually echoes, I was discussing the press coverage with a writer the other day who reviews a lot, and I said, the reviewers tend to not review translated fiction as much, and what you were just saying, and she pulled me up short saying, no, it's the books editors, it's the literary commissioning editors on the press and the magazines who don't cover translation. The Guardian are fantastic, but the other broadsheets are not so good. So that I will just leave that out there. They're missing a beat there.
Well, I think that they are improving. I think the the Financial Times is doing a lot more, and even the Sunday Times, has introduced this roundup, which I think is monthly, of, foreign fiction. I think it's the wrong way to go about it. Personally, I wish that it would just, books should be considered on their own merit, but still, it's a good thing that they're being covered more and more. And I think this is less and less of an issue, and I imagine it will disappear completely in another, 5 to 10 years at the longest.
So looking into your crystal ball, in the wake of Brexit and now the coronavirus pandemic, what does the future hold for so-called traditional publishing, in your view?
I have no crystal ball, but I'm very optimistic. I've been doing what I've been doing over 20 years, and fundamentally it hasn't really changed. We have to be creative and ever more creative and innovative about the way that we reach readers, but that was ever thus, I think, and I feel pretty optimistic about the future of the book. And I think when ebooks first came out and the Kindle was first released, there was a lot of fear among publishers, perhaps even more when the iPad was released. I think that's completely changed, and it's now just another format in which books are published, and it's very clear that the two don't compete with each other so much as coexist very nicely. And most people, everyone I know, and I think, people who read ebooks also read print books. And even if that's not always the case the other way around, 90% of Pushkin sales are still print. And as an industry, it's probably 75 to 80% print sales. So I don't think the kind of traditional print book is going anywhere. But yeah, we have to keep adapting.
So who would be in your dream book club?
That's a good question. It's, I think just to be honest, it's about other passionate readers, people who care about, read carefully and and want to talk about what they read. I actually am in a book club myself, which is probably quite unusual for a publisher, but I've been doing that for about 15 years, every other month, with a group of friends, none of whom is in the industry, none of whom works, none of them are in this business. But they're all very keen readers, and we have very good, interesting conversations. So they're my dream book club already, in a way, because we've had some wonderful conversations about books over the 15 years that I've been doing it. You can't be in this business without being optimistic. Also, given the failure rate of most books, you have to remain optimistic. Even when you know a book probably isn't going to work, but you love it and you buy it even against your better judgment. But once in a while, those turn out to be the best decisions you've made.
So are you a gambler in that case?
Absolutely. I think all publishers are gamblers. You're gambling on every book. And the other way to look at it is every book, especially by an unpublished author, a new author, is like a startup business. And that gives you a sense of how challenging it is to be a publisher, and also the success and failure rate which exists among startups is similarly echoed in the publishing world.
And do you have a motto?
You're taking a lot of knocks along the way when you're in publishing. Things don't sell the way you'd like, or a book gets incredible coverage and yet no one's buying it, whatever it might be. So I just kind of think, all right, on we go, onwards and upwards. We have to move on and look forward to the next thing.
Thank you, Adam. Thank you very much.
To find out more about Pushkin Press and their books, visit website www.pushkinpress.com. Their Twitter feed is @PushkinPress. This podcast is brought to you by Book Blast. For more bookishness between episodes, visit online journal, The Book Blast Diary, or find us on Twitter @BookBlast. Special thanks to sound editor Rupert, theme tune composer Edward Campbell, and to publisher Adam Freudenheim for taking the time to be interviewed. And thank you all for listening to this week's episode of the Book Blast podcast.